him to consult to the Israeli government, and we thought what was the most important problem in behavioral economics, and talked with some policymakers, and what they told us that the most important problem is populism, in the sense that the public, for some reason, that the politician, for some reason, advance policies that do not serve the public, but the public thinks that they are, but the public like them. And what they challenge us to come up with method to reduce populism. And we were surprised to see that there's no research on behavioral economics on this topic, that the policymakers think that the most important problem in behavioral economics. So I start reading papers on populism, and I like the review by Sheri, and this is why I invited to talk. And I think this is specifically important for people who study decision from experience, because the question is why the public does not understand, prefer policies that does not serve them, or it seems to us that they do not serve the public. Okay, so Sheri, I'll move to mute.
Thank you, Ido. And Sheri, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm a political scientist, and so I will tell you a little bit more about how political scientists, and indeed more generally social scientists, think about these things, and then maybe we can discuss some of the more specific questions that Yefim and others raised when they contacted me. So there's obviously lots of discussion, across the globe about democracy's problems today. Let me see if I can figure out how to make this thing move now. There we go. Okay. So again, this is obviously not news to anyone in this room, hence your interest in the topic. Lots of talk about what's going on with democracy today. Now, outside of the advanced industrial world, right, that is to say mostly the West and some countries in Asia, we've not seen significant democratic backsliding. That is to say, countries that have been democracies for extended periods of time with advanced industrial economies have not slid back into authoritarianism. So that's an important thing to note, because when we're talking about countries like, countries in Europe or North America, we're not so much talking about countries that have slid back into authoritarianism. We're talking about countries where there is significant dissatisfaction with democracy. And one of the most obvious manifestations of that is the rise of populist parties. I should say that among scholars, political scientists, and others who study democracy, the only two countries in that category of advanced industrial democracies with significant democratic backgrounds that countries that social scientists actually think are in danger, have not, but might be in danger of backsliding, actually is your own country, Israel, and the country that I'm sitting in, the United States, right? So these are the two countries within that category that social scientists worry most about, where they've seen some significant signs of democratic erosion and democratic weakening, right? But in other parts of the West, right, as this sort of chart here kind of indicates, what we're dealing with is not so much backsliding defined as slipping back into authoritarianism, but significant dissatisfaction with democracy related, manifested, reflected in the rise of populist parties.
Can I comment?
Can you comment? Sure,
Yes.
if you like. Go ahead.
I was wondering, the social scientists are worried about Israel and the United States. What about countries like Turkey or Poland?
So that's exactly why I characterize it that way, right? So countries like Turkey and Poland, right, these are relatively new democracies. That is to say, democracies that transitioned from authoritarian to democratic regimes during what we call often the third wave. That is to say, the wave of democratization that began at the end of the 20th century and lasted into the beginning of the 21st century. So I'm not saying, that's not what I said, was that there were no really important cases of backsliding. There are many important cases of backsliding, and the two that you discussed, Turkey and I would say Hungary more than Poland, right? Poland was considered to be kind of on the edge, and over since the last election is seen as sort of pulled back from that edge somewhat, right? But what I'm saying is when we think about democracies, we have to think about different types of democracies, right? And if we think about democracies that are of long standing, that is to say, were democracies before the third wave, yeah, and also crucially important for political scientists, have advanced industrial economies, right? So if we're thinking about that category, significant democratic background, that is to say, democratic before the third wave, and advanced industrial democracies, the only countries in that category, right, that are considered to be in danger, significant danger over the medium term, are the United States and Israel, right? When we look at Western Europe, for example, I'm going to talk a lot about that today. These are countries where, as the previous slide pointed out, right, you have some real dissatisfaction with the way democracy works, and again, reflected, manifested by the rise of populist parties, right? But a slide back into authoritarianism within that category of advanced industrial democracies with significant democratic experience, that we do not have. Now, there has been a lot of backsliding since the third wave. That is to say, since that period of immense democratic transitions at the end of the 20th century. But the countries that have backslid since then have been countries that A, made transitions during that time, and B, often fall into the less developed category, less developed economically category, right? So Turkey and Hungary are in fact very interesting because those are countries that are, middle income or above, right? And so generally social scientists associate more developed economies with more democratic success for reasons I'm happy to talk about, but I'm guessing you are probably aware of. But what was lacking in those countries, right, was the experience with democracy, right? And that's important, again, as I'm happy to talk about, because it tends to give democratic institutions and norms in those countries more significant anchoring, right? And therefore, they become more resistant to erosion. Yeah, so absolutely lots of backsliding, right? But not among the countries that fall into that category of advanced industrial economies with significant experience with democracy. So I mean, and again, we can talk a lot more about these things. And generally, the norm in political science is to wait, but I'm happy to take questions, at any point during this talk, especially if I say something that requires clarification, because of course, sometimes even when I try, I will say things that I assume make sense to people, but oftentimes if you're not within the sort of doom loop of political science, may not, right? So here's just a graph obviously reflecting rising vote shares for populist parties. And I'm going to focus mostly on Western Europe, again, within that category of advanced industrial democracies with significant democratic experience. I will mention the United States, but I am happy also to talk about other cases. I'm just going to focus on this one because it happens to be one I know very well. And, just for sort of time constraints, I figured I would do that, but happy to take Q&As on other things. All right. So this is what's happened with populist parties in Western Europe during the late 20th and early 21st century. And you can see the obvious trends here, right? And the financial crisis is an important breaking point for reasons that I will discuss, although important to note that populist parties existed obviously before 2008, but got a significant bump by that. And when I'm talking about populism in this talk, I'm really going to focus on right-wing populist parties, because frankly, in Europe and in the United States also, this is the type of populism that dominates. If I was talking about Latin America, obviously I would have to be more balanced because their left-wing populists are an important part of the political story as well. Okay, so again, I'm focusing on right-wing populism in my comments today. Now, there is a lot of research, as you are aware, presumably that's why I'm here, about populism, right? And this literature has now been embedded in not just political science, obviously, but economists have produced a lot of research on populism, sociologists and psychologists as well. So it's really an incredibly rich literature, and one of those literatures that has benefited from contributions from across the social sciences. But what happens sometimes in that kind of situations is these literatures don't always speak to each other very well. But I will try to sort of discuss some of the places where they have talked to each other. Now, this literature has identified many factors that are correlated with populism, right? Where the arguments really tend to be most heated is not in the correlations. We can obviously see lots of things that are related to rising populism that correlate with it, but where the really interesting arguments are, where the interesting research is focused, is in the causes. Right? So correlations, are important, but causality is what we're really interested in, right? Because we want to understand what causes this phenomenon, because if we don't understand the causes, we can't, at the very least, come up with some potential solutions to the populist surge. So what I'm going to talk about today is various arguments about causality, right? About the variables that social scientists, with some emphasis obviously on political science, since I know that literature best, some variables that social scientists, political scientists think are not merely correlated with populism, but actually cause it, right? That is to say, more specifically, cause voters to vote for populist parties, to support populist politicians, right? Before moving on, let me just say something about what I mean when I use the term populism. Now, there are many, many definitions of populism, just like there are with lots of other terms. We throw them around. Liberalism, many different interpretations of what liberalism is. Democracy, dozens of different, believe it or not, dozens of different definitions of democracy, right? But I want to try to be a little bit more specific when I throw around this term populism, so we know the kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about, and in particular, the kinds of things that are worrisome, the characteristics of populism that are worrisome for democracy. So lots of definitions of democracy. I would say at the core of pretty much all of them are a couple of distinctive features, right? So I'm going to give you a sort of minimal definition of populism here, right? So one key feature that all populist parties, I'm going to focus, as I said, on right-wing populist parties, but this is true of the left-wing ones too, is that they are anti-establishment. Now, all political parties are potentially opposition parties, right? To say you oppose another party does not make you populist, right? All parties and politicians are opposed to their opponents, right? They think they're better. They think their opponents are, sort of have less good positions and policies, right? That's not what anti-establishment means, right? That's being in opposition is not being a populist, right? What is distinctive, right, is an opposition to what is called the establishment. That is to say, to the status quo, right? To the establishment, other existing parties, right? Viewing that status quo and other parties as corrupt, as illegitimate, as not representing what is often called the real will of the people, right? So anti-establishment is not merely oppositional, right? It is taking a position that not just is against all other parties and, sort of the existing institutions and elites, but does not simply say that we, this populist party or this populist politician, disagree with them and think we have better policies, but rather that they are just wrong, corrupt, and illegitimate, right? That is anti-establishment parties, right? That is what anti-establishment rather means. Now, two things follow from this anti-establishment stance that is distinctive to populism, right? First is they don't aim merely to put in place new policies, right? All parties and politicians say, look, I have policies, they differ from those of my opponents. I'm going to come to power and put them into place, right? What makes this distinctive in populists is that because of this anti-establishment stance, because of the belief that the entire status quo is corrupt and that other mainstream parties are as well, they want to revamp the entire system, right? And this can obviously easily shade not just into illiberal, but anti-democratic efforts. It does not need to. Anti-democratic does not have to be an explicit goal of populist parties, but it very well might be. Some populist parties are anti-democratic, but they need not be, right? But they do aim, at the very least, again, to kind of significantly revamp the entire system. This stance does imply, if not a desire to overthrow democracy and replace it with authoritarianism, at the very least, generally a lack of respect for the democratic rules of the game, right? Because since the system is seen as so corrupt, right, populists, when they get into power, may need to bend democratic rules, right, dramatically reshape democratic institutions in order to really fix the system's problems, right? So that's important, right? Anti-establishmentism and a desire to revamp the system that may very well shade into not just illiberalism, but anti-democratic politics, and if not fully anti-democratic politics, again, a willingness to play around with the democratic rules of the game. The second tendency that follows from that anti-establishment stance, which I already sort of gestured towards, is a tendency to demonize your opponents, right? So again, to characterize those individuals who don't vote for you, those parties who are not part of, your coalition, whatever, as bad, corrupt, dangerous, right? And this again is very different, right? Because what you're doing now is just saying that those who are outside of my party or coalition are not just people who disagree with me, but people who are dangerous, right? They're enemies, right? And often with right-wing populists, this shades into demonizing not just other parties, not just establishment elites, but minorities, racial, ethnic minorities, yada, 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 right? So that's sort of important. Anti-establishmentism, a desire to revamp the system that might include, again, a willingness to play with the democratic rules of the game, and a demonization of one's opponents. All right, so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about populism. So how have social scientists tried to understand this phenomenon? What are the kind of main causes of rising support for populist parties? So one way that I think is helpful in characterizing these different types of explanations is by dividing them into demand and supply side explanations. Now, again, these are not necessarily contradictory. You don't have to choose one or the other, but there is a significant difference in emphasis in these kinds of explanations. So demand side explanations. Demand side explanations locate the main sources of populism in voter grievances. That is to say, in voter demands. Yeah. And here, these demand side explanations tend to fall into two types of categories. Those that emphasize economic grievances as being at the root of the demand for populism, so to speak, or at the root of a decision to vote for a populist party, versus social or cultural grievances being at the heart of populism support. Right. So I'll talk about both. And then, of course, there are explanations that mix the two. I will discuss those as well. Now, supply side explanations, on the other hand, right, take what might be called a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up, right? So bottom-up meaning, again, we're starting with voters. We're looking at the societal or voter roots of populism. Supply side explanations are top-down explanations, right? Here, the main cause of populism is existing political institutions, right? That is to say, the argument here is that when existing political institutions, right, are not doing their job, and that might be operationalized as them being unresponsive and unrepresentative, I will talk about that, you get growing populism, right? So this is top down because it's starting not with voters, but it's starting with political institutions, governments, mainstream parties, yada, 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 right? So these are the two types of explanations that dominate in the literature, right? And they locate the causes of populism in very different places, right? And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the role of political actors and agency. All right, so let's start with the demand side, right? As I said, demand side explanations tend to come into two varieties: those that focus on economic grievances and those that focus on social and cultural grievances, right? So the economic explanation may be the most popular one, or the most intuitive one, maybe the one that's heard, sort of most often in sort of commentary, right? And here the argument is pretty straightforward, right? That economic development over the past decades, late 20th, early 20th century, right, has changed the nature of Western economies in ways that have generated, again, growing inequality, increasing economic insecurity, deepening divisions between not just citizens, but regions and countries, successful coastal urban regions where the economies have kind of thrived in this new globalized open economy, and, sort of more rural areas that have not been able to take advantage of the opportunities of this, new type of capitalism, right? So that's the argument, right? And the economic grievances that have been generated by changing economies lead voters to support populism. Now, these types of explanations, these economic grievance-based explanations, get some important things right? And here's just two, again, sort of common examples of this type of arguing, right? And I just plucked them from, what are probably the two most prominent economics commentators in the English-speaking world, both obviously right for the FT. I'm sure you're familiar with them, Martin Sandbu and Martin Wolf, right, who have made arguments along this line, right, which is that the changing nature of capitalism has generated all of these problems, and these problems have led many citizens in Western democracies to feel aggrieved, resentful, left behind. And it's these, sort of economic grievances that have led them to support populist parties, right? So these explanations, again, are, have some strong suits, right? The most obvious of which is that they are intuitive, right? Which is we see these changes and we can see the consequence of these changes, right? There's also a strong temporal correlation here, right? Populism's support has risen at the same time as we've begun to really feel the negative consequences of what you might, call neoliberal globalized capitalism, right? So we can see this correlation in time. Populism has grown at the same time as sort of this new, or not so new anymore, neoliberalized capitalism has taken hold in Western societies, and, things like inequality and insecurity, we can understand why that might disorient and anger many citizens, right? And there's also lots of studies that show strong correlations between certain types of economic events. Financial crisis, you might remember that earlier slide. There's a strong spike in support for populism after the financial crisis. So there's been studies by economists and others that have shown financial crises, economic crises are linked with growing support for populism. There's also very good research showing that austerity policies, again, also tend to produce growing support for populist parties. Right? So there's a lot of evidence, again, linking certain economic events or policies or whatever to rising support for populism. But there are some real weaknesses in this type of approach. The most obvious is that there's very little agreement among social scientists on what the actual mechanism here, right? That the mechanism linking economic changes in the macro economy to increased proclivity to vote for populism, right? What is the translation mechanism here? So there's not a lot of really good evidence cross-nationally that individual economic characteristics tend to lead to rising support for populism. Poor people are not strong populist voters. Even necessarily people who have suffered most from inequality, people who have, sort of lost their jobs, things like that. There's not a lot of sort of support for individual level economic characteristics being linked to populist voting. The other problem with these kinds of explanation, of course, is that right-wing populists do not generally mobilize around economic grievances, right? Anybody who's spent any time, sort of listening to right-wing populism, right-wing populist politicians understands that their attention, right, is mostly focused around social and cultural issues, right? That these are the things that they emphasize most in their appeals. Social and cultural grievances are the things that they really mobilize and organize around, right? And so understanding that, if you're going to go with a explanation that's based in economic change, is a puzzle, right? Because if what they're really feeding on is economic grievances, then that is what they should focus on. And indeed, populist parties do not, as anyone who has listened to them knows, right? So that's also a problem with these explanations. They can't give us insight into why populists, right-wing populists, tend to focus on these social and cultural issues. All right, so the other type of demand-side explanation then focuses on those social and cultural grievances, right? It says, look, what lies at the heart of populism, right, is social and cultural trends over the past several decades, right, that have threatened what might be considered to be traditional values, status hierarchies that exist in Western societies, demographic changes that have really made white citizens, and particularly white citizens from low education and working class backgrounds, feel uncomfortable, resentful, and angry, right? And so again, we can see some obvious sort of intuitive evidence for this. Populist voters tend to sort of think that the world used to be better, and by this they don't mean better simply because we were wealthier. They tend to mean better in the sense of, sort of, I understood the world, I felt like it was part of it, things were comfortable to me, right? And also intuitive here or helpful here is the fact that if you're going to actually pick one variable that would enable you to predict voting for populist parties, right? And this is true in Western Europe. In the United States, it would be true as well, especially if you layered on a racial resentment category. So if you wanted to pick one variable that would enable you to predict whether or not someone would vote for a populist party, right? Preferences on immigration policy, and in the United States, if you layered onto that, sort of a racial resentment score, that would give you the best chance of choosing correctly, right? That is to say, these are the sort of attitudes, right, that are most directly correlated with populist voting. All right, so that's the advantages of this type of explanation, right? But there are real problems with looking purely at social and economic grievances as well. The first problem is that there's almost no temporal correlation between levels of racist or anti-immigrant sentiment and populist success, right? So we've had, again, as you are aware, right, growing support for populism over the past decades with a particular shoot up after the financial crisis, but this does not correlate at all with rising anti-immigrant or racist sentiment, right? And in fact, during those decades, racism and anti-immigrant sentiment has declined almost uniformly across the West. So that's puzzling, right? Because the temporal connection does not lie there at all. There's also no cross-national variation, right? So if you were to look at levels of racist or anti-immigrant sentiment across Western democracies, right? What you would see is that the countries that have the highest level of racism or anti-immigrant sentiment are not the countries with the highest levels of support for right-wing populism, and vice versa, right? So my favorite example of this is Sweden, which you can see from these graphs almost always scores at the bottom of any of these kinds of measures. But yet you now have a right-wing populist party in Sweden that is the second largest party in the country. It is the largest party on the right. And again, this cannot be explained by the absolute levels of racial animus or anti-immigrant sentiment. This is true in the United States as well, right? Despite all of the talk of, sort of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment, there is not a correlation over time, right? People did not all of a sudden become more racist and anti-immigrant and then voted for Trump, right? There's just no correlation either temporally or cross-nationally, right? So in a way, this kind of explanation, the social and cultural grievances explanation, has is the flip side of the economic grievances explanation. On the economic grievances explanation, we can see that macro correlation, right? Changes in the economy correlate with rising support for populism, but the micro foundations of the economic grievance-based explanations are very unclear. The social and cultural explanations have the flip side, right? We can see a direct connection between having racist and anti-immigrant sentiment and voting for populist parties, but there's no macro correlation. I will explain to you why that is the case in a minute. But again, this is important to note that, you know, both of these types of explanations have some strong advantages, but some very clear drawbacks as well. All right. So again, just pointing out, there's really no clear relationship between levels of populist sentiment and actual support for right-wing populist parties. This is just a recent treatment by a very well-known American political scientist, a very prominent student of, you know, political behavior and you know, sort of voting behavior. And this is important, right? This last statement, I'm going to talk more about this. He notes that where populist entrepreneurs, and that term is very important for him, right, have succeeded, they have done so by tapping a reservoir of populist sentiment that existed all along. I'm going to talk more about this term reservoir again. Okay, so we know that social and cultural grievances are tied to populist voting, but we also know that a focus on them alone cannot explain the changing fortunes of populist parties over time or space, right? Again, because if you look at the macro level, we can see that these social and cultural grievances, right, do not always seem to significantly affect voting, right? That's the point of this reservoir concept that Bartels gives us, right? So the question then is, what kinds of situations, in what contexts, right, do these social and cultural grievances or preferences become politically significant, right? It's not that they've grown over time in populations, right? They are there, right? But in some places, and in sometimes this reservoir becomes politically important, while in other times these sentiments just do not matter to voting, right? So that's the question. And this is where explanations that mix economic and social and cultural factors have tried to intervene, right? So this is a very popular argument among some economists and some political scientists, right? A sort of explanation that tries to mix the sort of macro level economic changes with these sort of with a micro level emphasis on social and cultural grievances, right? So here, right, the argument is that certain economic conditions, the ones that I talked about, economic crises, growing insecurity, inequality, particular, you know, sort of susceptibility to the consequences of free trade, right? That these economic changes or economic contexts create an opportunity to increase the salience of social and cultural grievances. Now, this term salience is really important. Maybe it's kind of totally familiar to you, but I often speak to audiences for whom this word is not, the significance of this word is not fully understood. Now, it's important to remember when we try to understand why voters choose to vote for populists and right-wing populists, that voters have all types of preferences, a lot of opinions, right? But not all of these opinions and not all of these preferences matter to their voting. Now, sometimes preferences don't matter, right? Let's say you have a preference for lower levels of immigration, right? Because it's not your most pressing concern, right? I prefer that we had fewer immigrants, but this is not my most pressing concern, right? So we know that voters have this preference. A voter has this preference for less immigration, let's say, but it's not his or her most pressing concern. So I'm not going to choose a party on that basis. I, for instance, have a strong preference for stricter gun control legislation, right? But I probably will not vote on that basis because there are other things that are more important to me. If I was a member of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, I would vote on that preference. But this is a preference that I have, but it's not politically salient. I'm not going to vote on that basis because there are other things that are more important. So even though I have, let's say, an anti-immigrant preference, I'm not going to necessarily pick a party on that basis. You may also have a preference, right? And it might even be a strong one, but there's no party around that's mobilizing on that basis. So you can't vote on it. right? So I, for instance, also, I'm a strong advocate of animal welfare. Very important to me. I'm a vegetarian. But there aren't parties out there that are mobilizing around that issue. So even though that is indeed a very strong preference of mine, a very strongly held opinion, it's not going to influence my vote because there's no party out there that's offering me the ability to vote on that preference along with other things that are important to me, right? So it's very important to understand that voters can have these preferences, but they may not be politically important. They may not, therefore, be salient. And this is why a focus on salience is so important, right? Because it helps us understand that sort of seeming puzzle that I mentioned before, which is to say that it's clear that social and cultural grievances are connected to voting in the sense that they are a good predictor of it, but they are not always that way. Only at some times and in some places, right? So again, this is the argument, famous argument made, for instance, by David Autor and his colleagues. I'm sure you're all familiar with this since I understand some of you are economists, right? And his argument here is that in places, communities, right, that were particularly subject to trade shocks, right, these trade shocks created an opportunity for certain kinds of politicians to come in and mobilize around those social and cultural grievances, not to create them. They were there, right? They don't create these attitudes. They simply whip them up. They make them more salient, right? And a very similar argument has been made by Calantoni and Stanig in the European context, right? So again, the preferences alone are not important. They're the preferences in a context that allows them to become politically salient, yeah? And we have a lot of literature actually that makes similar kinds of arguments. So for example, a political scientist who studies immigration in Europe has found that, again, when immigration puts pressure on state-provided resources, that is to say, people begin to see a conflict between the resources going to immigrants and the resources available to them, their social and cultural grievances become more politically salient. Politicians have an opportunity to mobilize around them. Very similar finding, interesting in the Austrian case. Again, all of a sudden we have this court decision passed down that said that public housing in Austria had to be provided to immigrants. And as soon as that happens and the competition for those resources grows, we begin to see, sort of rising support for anti-immigrant policies. Now, again, the important thing here is not so much that these changes created that sentiment, it's that it becomes more politically salient. Yeah? All right. So that's the kind of demand side explanations, right? And they tend to fall, as I said, into the economic category, the social and cultural category, and one that mixes them. Right, so let's now switch over to the supply side explanations, right? Now here the focus is not on grievances, social grievances, cultural grievances, economic grievances, right? But on political institutions, right? And the causality here is flipped, right? The argument here is that if parties, mainstream parties, and governments respond to the challenges that they face, economic change, demographic change, whatever, then you won't get grievances, right? Grievances come when existing parties and political institutions don't do their job, right? So the independent variable here, the main independent variable here is the inability or unwillingness of the establishment, mainstream parties, political institutions, to respond to the challenges that their societies face, right? Or again, to be responsive to the needs of their citizens, right? So this is flipping the causality around, right? And there's lots of versions of this type of explanation. If we look at Europe, for example, right, there's lots of people who talk about, problems emanating from the European Union, right? That the European Union has, sort of limited the ability of democratic national level democratic governments to respond to the demands of their citizens, right? It's limited their economic policy tools, it's limited their economic policy choices. It's put in place all kinds of regulations that citizens dislike and feel they have no control over, sort of yada, 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 right? So this has limited the ability of national level democratically elected governments to be responsive to the needs of their citizens, right? Another version of this is, again, that simply by limiting what governments can do, national level governments can do, by constraining them, right? They've also created resentments or dissatisfaction with those democratically elected governments, right? Because they see that they're, again, unwilling, unable to, engage in the kinds of policy responses that citizens prefer or demand. Supply side explanations have also focused a lot on the changing nature of political parties. Again, I'll talk about this just for very briefly in the European context. We've seen a whole variety of changes within mainstream parties within Western Europe. They have become, for a whole variety of reasons, less responsive, fewer ties to linking civil society organizations, unions, religious organizations in the context of center-right Christian democratic parties. They have, again, fewer ties to sort of local level activists and leaderships that have become more divorced from voters, highly educated, not coming up through the ranks of, sort of unions or religious groups or other kinds of things, right? And so the argument here is that these parties have done a less good job of linking to voters, and therefore people feel, sort of more separate from or dissatisfied with them. There's been in particular a lot of emphasis in changes in parties of the center left. I've spent a decent bit of time kind of talking about this as well. And the reason for focusing on the center left is that historically, the main constituents of right-wing populist parties, low-educated, working-class voters, historically, these voters voted for socialist, social democratic, and labor parties, right? And so now the fact that these voters have now shifted to the populist right has led many people to ask, well, why? Why did they vote for socialist, social democratic, labor parties, up through the end of the 20th century, and now these types of voters are disproportionately voting for populist right parties? So here, again, the argument is on how parties themselves have changed, leading voters to kind of shift their allegiances, right? The emphasis here with regard to center-left parties is how they changed their economic profile, right? Historically kind of very much associated with a strong left-wing economic profile, support for strong state regulations, constraining markets, extensive welfare states, public provision of a whole variety of social goods. But by the late 20th century, that distinctive economic profile had very much become attenuated, and lots of voters who were looking for that kind of thing saw that these parties were no longer able to provide it, right? They had become, in the famous words of Thomas Piketty, parties that were no longer appealing to low-income, low-educated voters, but to people like ourselves, right? Highly educated, middle-class elites and that kind of thing, right? All right. And we can see this very clearly in a whole variety of parties, these kind of center-left parties. The avatar, of course, of this trend was the Labor Party under Tony Blair. That cover from The Economist, by the way, is not photoshopped by me. That is, in fact, a real cover from The Economist, very much reflecting this point I was just making, right? Which is that, voters, low-income, low-educated voters who are looking for a party that championed them, that they felt was working in their interests. By this time, they didn't have that anymore, because Blair was clearly not a person who was of the working class and who many working class people felt was representing them. And this is reflected very clearly in the types of policies that labor put forward, a kind of third wayism, which again, I'm not arguing about its impact on a whole variety of sort of economic factors. You know, that's a separate story I'm happy to discuss, but in perceptions among voters, right? So if you look at what voters in Britain, for example, actually saw or actually thought of the parties, we can very much see, right, that during this period, they no longer see a huge economic difference between the Labour and Conservative parties, right? They very much saw that kind of dilution of the left's economic profile. And this was, of course, also true in the United States, right? You know, same time under Bill Clinton, the Democratic Party, which was, of course, never as far left on economic issues as many of its European counterparts, under Clinton, very much takes a shift to what, you know, was known in the United States, not so much as third wayism, but, you know, progressive neoliberalism. I would say that's a contradiction in terms, but whatever. And very much Clinton was seen as having shifted the Democratic Party's economic profile, very much towards, again, the sort of center, towards a neoliberalism light, blah, 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 blah. And this, again, is seen by many people as really changing the way voters perceived center-left parties, right? Who they stood for, who they were responsive to, who they championed.
You have just 5 more minutes.
Yes, I'll be done. And this is also, thank you for the reminder. I won't talk about this very much here, but I'm happy to do so. This was even more true, I might say, I would like to stress rather, in Eastern Europe, right? After the transition, which of course happens at the end of the 20th century, we get obviously social democratic, socialist, you know, parties in Eastern Europe, but they come online, they come into being very much during the heyday of neoliberalism. And these parties never ever have left-wing economic profiles. They are, in fact, more ardent champions of neoliberalism than parties that are ostensibly on the right. And so it is perhaps not surprising that as soon as the negative consequences of those neoliberal reforms become felt in Eastern Europe, a lot of voters simply abandon these parties, right? Because there's nothing left-wing about them. Okay. So just again, to kind of sum up this argument about, you know, sort of the left, right? The argument here from the supply side is very much captured by this very nice quote by a French playwright, an intellectual who wrote a nice short article about why his father voted for and votes for Marine Le Pen, right? Elections were a chance for my father to fight his sense of invisibility. He felt abandoned since the 1980s when the left stopped speaking of class and became more like the right. In the absence of any attempt by the left to discuss his suffering, my father latched onto false explanations offered by the far right. To persuade my family not to vote for Le Pen, it is not enough to show that she is racist and dangerous. Everyone knows that already. It's not enough to fight against hate or against her. We have to fight for the powerless, for a language that gives hope to the most invisible people, people like my father, right? So again, similar kind of quote, a feeling that the left no longer represented him, and so he has now decided to throw in his lot with the populist right, who, even though he may not believe their solutions, seems to very much speak to his resentments and angers. One last thing I just want to stress before I sort of end is that, you know, another consequence looking at the supply side of this shift on the part of center-left parties is that we also begin to see, partially as a consequence of that, a growing emphasis on social and cultural issues, right? As the left becomes less economically distinctive, it spends more time talking about social and cultural issues, and it is very progressive or far to the left on these issues in comparison to the preferences of its previous voters, that is to say, low-income, low-educated voters, and in fact, in voters in general, right? There's been a lot of studies of this. And this is important because this creates what political scientists call a representation gap. That is to say, there is a gap between what voters, and particularly low-income, low-educated voters, prefer on social and cultural issues, and what mainstream parties, particularly center-left parties, are offering on those social and cultural issues, right? I spoke about the Swedish case a little while back. Here is some insight into that puzzle, which is to say that Swedes are not racist or anti-immigrant in a cross-national comparison. But what you had in Sweden, which was very causally significant, is that up through the 2015 refugee crisis, all of the parties, including parties on the center right, were offering policies on immigration that were far from the preferences of Swedish voters. A Swedish voter who was even hesitant about or moderate on immigration issues simply did not have a party that represented those views up through 2015. This representation gap meant that there was an opportunity for what turned out to be a right-wing populist party to take advantage of that discrepancy or gap. Okay, and last thing I'm going to say is that in response to this gap and to the shift on the part of the center left, what we saw on right-wing populist parties, within right-wing populist parties, was very much a shift of their own economic profile. In the 1980s, when these parties arose in many countries, they were very conservative on economic issues. By the end of the 20th century, they have shifted their economic profile. They are now almost always in Western Europe, and you can see these kinds of tendencies within the Republican Party today. They shifted to the center on economic issues. And this was very important because they could not capture a lot of those low-income, low-educated voters with far-right economic policies, even if they offered right-wing social and cultural ones. By shifting to the center, they were able to capture that reservoir of voters that they could not have captured before. And so this is the story, right, that helps you understand why these right-wing populist parties have been able to capture so many low-income, low-educated voters. Voters, again, who in a previous era might have naturally voted for center-left parties are now the natural constituents of populist right-wing parties. And this shifting profile of these populist parties, right-wing populist parties, along with the shifting profile of other parties, is one way to explain this. This is also, of course, relevant in the American case. So I will stop there and take any questions if anyone has.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. And now those who have questions can just raise their hand. Yes, Ido.
So thanks, that was really interesting. One thing that the connection to behavioral economics is the fact, and he didn't talk about it, is the fact that many populist leaders do not like the title populist. So I wonder what are the common explanation for this tendency. So I thought that the fact that they don't like this title suggests that maybe they know that what they're doing is what they're proposing is not actually good for the public, but there are probably other explanations. What do you think is the reason for that?
So I mean, I don't know why any one particular politician likes one label or another, but I will say that it might very well be related to this point that I tried to make at the beginning, right? Which is in, sort of countries like the United States or Israel or Western Europe, right? Where democracy has long anchoring, right? Nobody comes out and says, I'm trying to get rid of democracy. Nobody even sees themselves in that way, right? They present their policies as kind of improving democracy or making it more responsive to the true will of the people, right? This is really a more democratic reform, right? It's more democratic for me to come into office and sweep partisans out of the bureaucracy, right? Or eliminate hindrances to my ability, I was elected after all, to do the things that I want, right? So they don't either see themselves as anti-democratic, nor can they sell their policies to their voters that way, right? They see themselves, again, as trying to fix a system that is not serving the will of the people, but is serving some kind of, out of touch elite or minority or something like that. And so insofar as that populist label seems to have a pejorative connotation. I think a lot of populists, using again the minimal definition that I put forward at the beginning, don't believe that, they don't see themselves that way, right? They see themselves as doing something that is in the service of the people and improving democracy and making it more responsive. And so that's the way I think that they, again, so far as populism seems to indicate something else, they don't like that.
Yes, Kinneret.
Thanks, Sheri, for this interesting talk. And again, I want to try to relate it to the decision-making, judgment and decision-making literature. And we talked a lot about polarization and how one of the main factors that leads to polarization is confirmation bias, which people tend to consume or to elaborate more on the argument that they like. And could it be that the rise of populism is related to some degree to the information era and the fact that this confirmation bias is just kind of exaggerated in this era? And I don't know, maybe this might be a technological change.
So absolutely, right. And that's not something I spent a lot of time talking about, but it is something that obviously social scientists have looked a lot at, right? And so one thing that, there's been a lot of research on, which I'm sure you're aware of since you asked the question, right, is how both intense partisanship and polarization, those are not exactly the same things, right? They're conflated, but they're not the same things, right? How both of those things have a tendency to increase this tendency towards confirmation bias, right? Like, so if you are a strong partisan of whatever, Donald Trump, right, that partisanship becomes, a sort of identity, and it therefore acts as an incredibly powerful filtering mechanism, right? Now, insofar as our information environment has changed so that you are better able to choose your own sources of information, right? So when we talk about, sort of the golden era in the 1970s in the United States, right, you'd have this sort of national news and it would sort of be presented and people wouldn't have that many other options. And so, even if you felt strongly Republican or Democrat, you'd still be kind of stuck listening to some fairly kind of, mainstream news sources, right? But that combination of partisanship and a better ability to select the things that you're hearing, right, is important, as is, right, again, the sort of tendency that we know from a lot of research, again, that I'm sure you're familiar with, that, you can even filter out. It's not even just that you choose to take in certain kinds of information, it's that you filter out or are better able to kind of explain away discrepant information. So that is absolutely the case. And there is a kind of vicious cycle aspect to this as well, right? Which is, the stronger your partisan beliefs, the more you kind of both filter and, sort of justify your opinions, and these kinds of things become sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. And again, to get back to the original, the first question, populists very much recognize this, which is why they are constantly talking about things like, fake news and stuff like that, because they're trying to get their voters, increase their voters' tendency to discount information that is discrepant in some way. So absolutely, I mean, social media matters. And it interacts with partisanship and polarization in, very, very problematic ways for democracy.
Sheri, thank you so much. This is very interesting. Now we have to end the formal part, so those who have to go can go, and we invite everyone to stay for a little bit more for the informal discussion part. So again, thank you for this very interesting presentation. And as I said, those who want to stay, we will continue. Any other questions?
I have one. You focus on the right wing, which I understand why, of course. But on the other hand, I don't know, in the last few months, I noticed something that maybe was kind of hidden and got more salient, which is very similar problems in the other extreme. So, and I see they seem more similar to me in many ways, in the ways that you said, that how they you said they demonize each other. No one is legitimate, and again, the confirmation bias also plays a role here. So they are reading only very specific types of information, in both, and I say it's not only the right side, that's what I'm trying to say. So I noticed that only in the last few months. Maybe it was there all the time.
Right. So that tendency, right, is not a peculiarly right-wing run, right? Like, so there's certainly that tendency exists on the left as well. The difference from, from the perspective of this talk or the topic is that in Western countries, right, that has not yet manifested itself, or it hasn't manifested itself in many places in, sort of left-wing populist parties. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not related to problems that democracy has, polarization, dissatisfaction with democracy, right? But if the goal was to sort of understand voting for parties that both reflect and deepen democracy's problems, then in the West, we're dealing primarily with right-wing populist parties. There are left-wing populist parties in some European countries, and I would say, sort of the party that probably best exemplifies the, sort of tendency that you're talking about would be Mélenchon in France, right? This is a left-wing populist party, and clearly he is, sort of not a friend of democracy, either in the sense of being a liberal, that is to say a small L liberal, but in also having some sort of tendencies that are, sort of democratically problematic in other ways as well. So left-wing populism absolutely exists. It's not as strong as right-wing populism, but the tendency to, again, sort of demonize, to engage in political behaviors that, deepen divisions within society, that polarize society. No, that's not an exclusive behavior on the right. It just happens to be that right-wing populist parties have been better able at mobilizing citizens in this particular type of way rather than left-wing populists.
Don.
Thanks, Sheri. That's really, really interesting. I really like it really puts things clearly with this analysis of supply and demand side. I was wondering, it's really hard to predict the future. It's a little bit easier to predict the past. And so we kind of saw maybe in the early 20th century similar surge of populism, both left and right. Do you see any similarities and to this supply demand side, the dynamics that you analyzed and showed us? And is there any lessons for our research going forward that we can focus on, given these lessons from the past, if they are relevant at all?
Right, so that's really a great question, right? And political scientists, social scientists love to be able to make predictions, right? Because it's what interests the public. I am not hubristic enough to be able to say that, but obviously, if we can't draw some lessons from the past, then there's really no point in studying it. So having hedged my bets that way, let me say the following, right? So there were certainly other periods, historical periods, when sort of populist parties of the type that I was talking about, sort of arose, right? And I would say, look, I gave you the demand and the supply side explanations. Social scientists, economists, political scientists, psychologists, they really prefer monocausal explanations. But obviously, the world is complicated, and the best explanations are not really monocausal. And I say that because clearly both these demand and these supply side factors matter. They mattered in the past, right? So you tend to see populist type parties arising, in times of great change, right? In times of really rapid change, economic change, social and cultural change. For example, the turn of the 19th, 20th century was absolutely a time like that. It was a time not just of sort of globalization and really rapid economic change, but of immense social and cultural change as well. It was not only a time of immigration, but it was a time when societies were modernizing in ways where, sort of, as Marx put it, all that solid was melting into air, right? Like, sort of traditional values, if you want to put it that way, were changing in ways, in the early 20th century, even much more rapid than they were today, right? So the fact that you saw the rise of all of these quote unquote anti-establishment parties during that time, is not surprising, right? So that is sort of the most obvious comparison. But I will say, if we look at that period and another period that's not completely analogous, but is closer to our own time, the 1960s, right? Huge amounts of upheaval in Western societies, lots of people supporting parties that were very questionable from a democratic perspective. And here's a place to return to the earlier question where the foment was really more on the left than on the right, right? Like people with sympathy for communism and Maoism, in retrospect, not very good political choices, right? But what are the lessons to learn from that, right? In places where you had significant grievances that were not addressed, either because politicians and parties were unwilling or unable to do so, right? You got, a sort of spiraling out of control to the point where democracy was really threatened, right? So if we look at the early 20th century, right, we know that this thing spiraled out of control in some countries. In some places, right, spiraled so out of control by the point of the interwar years that we got fascism and National Socialism, right? In other places, if we look at the Great Depression, right, now clearly, again, these are different kinds of countries, in places like the United States, or in Scandinavia, where governments were like, look, this economic crisis, this is a really bad thing. If we don't deal with this, our citizens are going to be willing to listen to the siren song of, whatever, fascists, National Socialists, and manage to put in place policies that, well, again, we can debate how much they actually solved the crisis, seemed very clearly to be responding to it. Sort of citizens, voters tended to their faith in democracy tended to be restored. Similarly, after the 1960s, look, very, very important grievances were raised during that period. Just as, frankly, very important grievances are being raised by populist voters today. The problem in the 1960s was that the way that a lot of people thought these grievances could be solved by, embracing communism or Maoism, that was really wrong. Similarly, right, grievances about economic or social and cultural change today are not necessarily wrong, right? These are real issues that societies need to deal with. In the 1960s, however, we saw that Western democracies kind of recalibrated, right? Did they solve all of these legitimate grievances that were raised about racism, about not fully confronting the past in Europe, about lack of rights for women, all these kinds of things? Did they deal with those things fully? No, racism remains, women are not fully equal in many ways, but they dealt with them enough so that sort of potentially revolutionary, but certainly disruptive period faded into the sort of semi-quiescence of the late 1970s, right? So again, what do we learn? We learn that grievances will expand in periods of rapid change, and that if mainstream parties and politicians don't deal with them, you can expect these things to be able to be exploited by people who do not have any interest in improving or fixing democracy, but rather in undermining it.
I was thinking about something, Idome, I don't know if it's related to your paper, so Ido has a nice paper about surprise triggered change, which in our concept means like that you make a repeated choice. So if there is something surprising outcome, you're more likely to think about your choice again. And it's more likely to switch your tendency to choose one side, one option, for example. And in many ways, I can think about all kind of crises that you describe, like economic crisis, social crisis, all kind of crises as kind of a surprising or kind of an extreme outcome event that make you think again. And by that, they increase a bit the likelihood that you will switch to something that is anti what is the status quo. Right? So isn't it something even more basic or natural phenomena in the sense?
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I get the argument that sort of surprising changes or rapid changes can force, sort of important political shifts. That seems right, both on an individual and a societal level. And again, I'm
right.
There's a lot of research about that kind of thing. But I'm not sure if I understand the sort of the follow-on part of that sort of question, or maybe it wasn't.
So it will increase the chances that you switch political parties or things like that. But specifically, it might increase the chances that you will switch to a more populist party because it's go against the status quo. So if you are in a kind of a status.
Yeah, no. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. Let me step back for a second and say, if we look at what happened with populist voting, right, and I'm just talking about populist voting here, obviously there are many other political consequences that might fit that sort of framework that you said, right? So if we look at populist voting, as you could, if you remember those sort of earlier graphs, there's this kind of gradual upward trend in support for these parties with a not insignificant jump after the financial crisis.
Mhm.
However, underneath that sort of broad trend, there's a lot of conflict and a lot of complicated things going on, right? So some of those things have to do with people who switch parties, right? That would be the most obvious correlate to what you're saying, right? This financial crisis is terrible. I was voting for a mainstream party. I'm now going to vote for a party that promises to shake everything up, right? That's a kind of dramatic change in your political, affiliation or whatever.
Mhm.
But there's also a lot of people, for instance, populists, and this was true in the past, if you want to think about the term populism very broadly, who are mobilizing or getting people to vote for them who just never voted, who have just dropped out of the voting core, right? So there's a lot of voting abstention in Western democracies, particularly among the low-educated, low-income voters that these parties really that disproportionately support these parties, right? So a lot of the support for right-wing populism comes not from people who have shifted from a mainstream party to a populist party, but from people who were just not voting for a very long period of time and then were just like, things are so shitty, I just didn't want to vote. But now there's a party that says things are shitty, so I'm going to vote for it. Okay. But there's also a third underlying trend in populist voting that's also very important, right? So there is a kind of trend where people move gradually, right? Which is to say that, they move, for example, from voting labor. Okay, let me not say labor because in two-party systems, this doesn't happen as much, right? So from voting from a social democratic party to then voting for a center-right party to then eventually voting for a populist right party, right? So that dramatic switch, like let's say from a social democratic to a far-right populist party, that's actually a relatively small percentage of populist voting. Much more common is a kind of gradual shift or almost again a shift out of the voting core and into the populist camp from that. And then the last thing I will say, right, because we've had right-wing populism for long enough, is there's a generational effect, right, which is that, again, if you were to go back to the 1980s and, know someone's income and education level, I'm telling you, voter X does not have a college degree and has a kind of more or less working class income. And I said to you, okay, look, I'm going to ask you to make a bet. Pick the party that person voted for. You'd pick the Labor Party or the Social Democratic Party or Social. You wouldn't be right all the time, but that'd be your safest bet. Today, of course, that's not true. But the reason for that is not just because of the shifts, right? From, let's say, left to right, or from left to center, right to right, or from, no voting to populist voting, but actually because of a generational shift. Because the identities of these parties have changed over time, the way people vote in different categories has also shifted. So we also have now a lot of populist voters, maybe the largest part, right, who have just come into the voting core as populist voters. So they're not shifting after, whatever, 2008.
From my point of view, from my point of view, they still switch from not being to get into the game. But again, I understand that this is a quality difference.
Yeah, so all I'm saying is that there are voters who might very well fit that. Okay, look, I'm a citizen. There's a shock. I'm reevaluating my voting and voting for a party that's quite different. But that category of people who fit into that category, what we know from voting studies is that's not an insignificant group, but it's not the majority, anywhere near the majority of populist voters. It was a long-winded way of saying that.
Thanks.
Okay, Sheri, thank you so much. This was very interesting talk.
Yeah, Finn, can I have one more, or is it like one
Yes,
question?
go ahead. The last one.
I remember that I used to say that the main predictor of someone whose party is going to vote for is what his parents voted to. Do you think it's also true today?
That's shifted. That shifted a lot, actually. So in Western Europe, for example, partisanship was very stable during the post-war decades. Stable in the sense that not only did voters tend to stick with the party, right, very different in the US, but that there was a significant inheritance of, sort of sympathy. That's much less true today. It's much less true today in Western Europe. It was never as true in the United States, although today, in a way,
It was never true in the United States?
No, in the United States, partisanship was never as strong as it was in Western Europe. It's much stronger now, right? So it's much stronger now. But what we have in the United States that's kind of, again, countered that a little bit, as I'm sure you're well aware, is a huge generational difference.
Yeah.
And so there's a significant generational effect that's going on politically in the United States. But in Western Europe, that passed down partisanship, so to speak, is much less than you would have seen, again, up through the late 20th century. It exists still, but it's not nearly as strong as it used to be.
Interesting.
So again, thank you so much. It was very interesting talk.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank
day.
you.
And maybe I will bug you with some email question later.
Sure, that would be great. It was nice to
Thank
meet
you. It
you
was
all,
great
even if just
introduction for
briefly
us.
virtually. Bye-bye.
Yes, and you
Thanks a
will
lot, Sheri.
hear from me as well in a few days.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
ביי.
אוקיי, יפים, יש לך רגע?
בוודאי.
כן, רציתי לשאול אם...
שנייה, אני אסגור את ההקלטה.
ביי
היי
חברים.
דורון, מה המצב? כן, תסגור את
בסדר.
ההקלטה.